CTE, yes, we're going to move that up. Potential consequences of placing non-CTE programs at the Sugar River Valley Regional Technical Center.
Well, thank you, everybody. This has been an issue that has kicked around the district for a long time. I think there's been a lot of confusion about what can and cannot be located here in the CTE Center. So I took some time to do some extensive research and spent some considerable time on the phone with Jeffrey Beard, who is the director overseeing all the CTE programs in the state. And I think I finally have some clarity on some of the points that have caused confusion in the past. Unfortunately, not some very the whole grant process itself has got a lot of ambiguity, and that ambiguity is probably part of the process by design, and that's because each program is so unique. It's very difficult to establish criteria that can be applied to all CTE centers when you're dealing with future grants. So let me start at the beginning here, and first I'll start with some of the confusion about can you even put non-CTE programming in the building, and I've come to the conclusion that yes, you can. There is a statute that talks about once a CTE program is built, it shall be used exclusively for CTE programming. There are administrative rules that talk about once the building is built, the district has to provide assurances that the CTE Center shall only include programs which are part of the approved qualified project. All these things create the impression that we can't use the building for anything but CTE programming. The state has already had to deal with this issue, and you can see documents coming from the state, including the 2011 Regional Model Agreement that recognizes the ability to put non-CTE programming. But there are limitations, and those limitations are that to the degree you're going to put non-CTE programming in this building, it can't supplant, hinder other CTE programming. So if there's a plan to expand CTE programming, you can't allow non-CTE uses to interfere with that. If there are current CTE programs, you can't move them out of the building because you want to put in non-CTE programs. But you can allow them to exist in what I would call vacant space. So if the district wants to move non-CTE programs into this building, it can do it.
Into vacant space.
Into vacant space. And it can't, but now this is where it gets, I think, a little bit more complicated. Because if you move, once you move it into the space, have you now created an impediment from the program growing additional programming? And that's where it becomes a problem, because if you have to go out after you've housed the program here and you have to find space to move it to, does that create an impediment? And if it does create an impediment, then I think it probably is violative of the exclusivity requirement. If it's truly vacant and it's not going to impede the growth of the programs in this building, you can use it. But if it does become an impediment in the future, it becomes a problem. The grant funding becomes even a little bit more complex. Again, as I said, the criteria for grant approval in large part focuses on need. And so need becomes really the concept that creates what, in my mind, is the potential. If you've got a lot of non-CTE programming in this building, you run the risk of creating the impression or the inference that there's not the need for the space. So if you're going to come and try to renovate this building, and there's a lot of vacant space in it that's being occupied by non-CTE uses, I think negative inferences can be drawn from that fact. So to the degree you start down this road of housing non-CTE uses here, absolutely legal, you can do it. But if you have future designs to secure grant funding to either expand the programming here or renovate the building, you run the risk of there being negative influences drawn from that. Now, one of the things I talked with Mr. Beard about also is this whole idea about changing the identity of this center. If this becomes known as the building that houses all the special ed programs for the school district, is it still a CTE program or is it a special ed program? And what does that do to the impressions about the building and how it's being used? And does it change the support for the center in a larger sense to grow the trades and the other programming that this building could house? And his concern was that, you start to change the identity of what this building is, it may eventually result in lower student demand, which is something that he's very concerned about. He wants to revitalize, he'd like to see more programming added, not things that might change the identity or cause the building to take on a different purpose. I think that's probably the best way to paraphrase some of his concerns. Can I say absolutely putting non-CTE programming here will result in you being denied future funding? I can't, because it's going to depend on what the need is for the funding. Like if you were to look for funding to replace all the kitchen equipment here, if the program is robust and there's good student enrollment and there's a good connection with the work industry, like the restaurant industry outside, you still may be very competitive, particularly on the federal side with these what we call Perkins 5 grants. These Perkins 5 grants don't really look at how the center is being used. They still look at need, they still look at connection to the working environment around here, but they're less concerned with how the building's being used. The restrictions on how the building's used are really state requirements that come from the state funds that are being poured in to build, establish, and renovate these buildings. These are state requirements, not federal requirements. All the things that talk about exclusive use or use by the CTE programming are all state requirements. They all exist in either state statutes or administrative rules. They're not part of the Perkins 5 grant, which is one of the larger grants. As a matter of reference, last year the state doled out a little over $6.5 million of Perkins 5 money. All the Perkins 5 money is governed by a 4-year plan that's put together by the state. That 4-year plan is in the process of being reintroduced beginning in 2024. The current plan runs through the end of 2023. What criteria they will put in that plan, I can't tell you because it's not available, but the past criteria for grants under Perkins 5 have really focused on performance, which really relates to student enrollment and student interest, which once again, if we lose the identity of the center, are we going to negatively impact student interest? Beyond that, I had a very interesting discussion about the utilization of the facility for non-CTE uses and whether those non-CTE uses could actually spur additional programming for students at the center. One of the examples I talked to Mr. Beard about is down in Georgia, where Georgia's school districts were having a problem with storage of files and documents and curriculum. And they actually put together a warehouse on the CTE program in vacant space, but they put together curriculum where students could learn how to archive documents, retrieve, destroy, destruct, all that archival skills that go on in every company now that's required either by law or by practice to manage large amounts of documents. So they were able to create programming around what would otherwise be a non-CTE use of storing district records. So, you know, to the degree you look at a developmental preschool, you could very well put together a program here where students could learn about early childhood development and could help prepare them for, you know, going to one of the local schools for early childhood development or working in the childcare industry. Same for, obviously, for autism programs. If you wanted to, you could have programs that work in conjunction with River Valley, or people can work on gaining certifications to be what they call a BST, which is behavioral, I think they call it behavioral strategy technician. Does that sound right, Ben?
Or RBT. Yes,
RBT,
sounds
right.
good.
Or
BCBA.
BCBA, all areas where there's a lot of growth. And so there are opportunities if you decide to go down the road of housing non-CTE programs where you could actually create programs that would be considered CTE programming where the underlying need is actually becomes part of the program itself and would be an appropriate use and would not have a negative connotation or a negative inference should you seek funding in the future. But once again, what are you doing to the identity of the center? And what is the direction you want to take the programming of the center in, and what's been happening in other regional centers, because all the approval of all this programming looks to try to focus needs within the region and not create competition between one CTE center and another. But to answer the question is this, in conclusion, is yes, you can do the programming here. If in the future you do go after federal grant funding or state grant funding, you do run the risk of negative inferences being taken from the non-CTE programming. How that would play itself out, I can't really tell you without looking at your future grant needs and applications, but it could be seen as a hindrance, or could also be seen as an indication of limited student demand.
Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Upton?
That's very thorough.
I think he explained it clearly.
Yeah.
I have questions.
Sure.
Because I always have questions.
Do you have a sense of what that percentage of utilization would look like that would be detrimental to, are we looking at 60-40 or 20-80, where your gut feeling is?
You know, I think anything beyond incidental use
What do you
is going to
describe
start to
as-
generate a question
And what
in the
would you
application
describe
process.
as incidental use?
Like if you add 5% to 10% of the use of this facility for non-CTE uses, I don't know that that would draw much attention. I think once you get above 10% and start to move 20, 30, if 40% of the facility is being used, I think it would be pretty significant. But again, if you're going to go to that level, you might want to consider whether you want to develop that programming where you could create lab schools where people could get certifications
Yeah,
Right.
that's what I
in
mean.
these other areas. I think if you're going to dive in at that level of, 20 to 40% of the facility being used for other
Right.
purposes, you might want to really think about whether you want to just do the associated programming as well.
I have one more question.
Sure.
Is there any way there could be hybrid utilization of the tech center without violating the spirit of the RSA? And what I mean by that is the city of Claremont has received a very large grant, which is for workforce development. And if we could utilize some of that grant money or come into a partnership with the city without attaching the school budget,
Yeah.
so we could provide a lot of opportunity that would be budget neutral, but opportunity positive to our students and to the community. How would that be viewed, since it would be funded from an external source.
So the whole exclusivity thing and the whole focus on how the facility is being used is really state-driven because the state provided the funding for this building. So the state is the one that's really consumed with that. The federal government, in my view, is less concerned with how the building is used, is more concerned with the state's plan, because the state becomes the administrator of most federal grants. And how the state plan is for how they intend to allocate those funds. From what I can tell, the Perkins 5 money, which is the largest percentage of federal funds, is all performance-based criteria. As far as what the city is looking at, I doubt highly that the city's grant would have any connection to how this facility is being used.
Well, for instance, if we need early childhood, if the grant determines
Yep.
that they do their investigation and they say, what we need in this area is X, Y, and Z,
Yep.
and we could link it
You could.
with CTE programming and use the funding
Yep.
from an external source. That's what I'm getting at, is
So
to
the-
be
so-
budget neutral but opportunity positive.
Doing a preschool that could be doing a preschool that's accessible to the entire community, including those that would be
Right.
part of workforce housing,
Yeah,
is actually a great opportunity to get atypical peers to work,
Right.
to work with your your developmental preschool.
Right.
It would also provide you with enough children that you could develop a lab school, much like what the
Right.
Concord Tech did.
We used to have that here.
but I'm
Yeah.
talking about how we're gonna fund it.
And you could probably revitalize that. And I know a lot of districts are doing it now and are charging for the preschool.
Right.
Or offering grants or a graduated scale based on income. And then working with developing a lab school would be a great idea. Now, what you're seeing is the state and federal government are starting to subsidize childcare. They're realizing that, as you might have seen on TV, childcare is the workforce behind the workforce. And that's something that's gaining a lot of interest right now. And the wages are gone up substantially. A lot of
Yep.
people working in childcare now a lot of starting rates are $18 to $20 an hour. So it's becoming really something viable that students may have an interest in pursuing. And a program like that, particularly if it were done with a developmental preschool, there are other options to partnering with River Valley and other schools where students could gain the basics that they need to advance into other areas.
Anybody else have any questions for?
But if you start going above,
Yeah.
above incidental use, just understand that if you go in the future, you could get negative inferences. Now, obviously, at the time you go for those grants, you could move those non-CTE uses out so that at the time the grant is actually filed, you don't get the negative inferences. But how it would play out is they're highly competitive. These grants often are highly competitive. And you don't want to have negative strikes against you, like you have large portions of your facility that are being used for non-CTE uses.
Thank you, this has been really valuable, and
Sure.
we've been waiting to
Yes.
hear some kind of guidance. and
Yeah.
So we appreciate
I
your
also,
time.
as things go forward, I talked with Jeffrey Beard about coming up, and both he and I, as things develop and if this workforce housing thing comes forward, he indicated he'd be glad to come up with, both he and I can come up with.
He has come up already, he's been at the visioning committee.
And he
meeting
probably
a
said
couple of
very
times.
many of the things that I've told you.
Absolutely, he has, yep,
Yeah.
which
Again,
we
okay.
reported out.
Great,
Thank you very much.
thank you.